There is a particular kind of silence that settles over the high desert just before dawn, not the peaceful kind, not the kind that invites sleep or stillness, but the kind that presses, the kind that has weight, the kind that makes a man aware of every breath he takes and question whether he has any right to be taking them. I have spent the better part of 14 years riding through that silence. I have slept inside it, eaten my cold beans inside it, buried 2 good horses and 1 decent friend inside it. And I thought for a long time that I understood it, that I had its measure, that the desert and I had come to some kind of understanding that didn't require words or ceremony or explanation. Then I met a woman named Nasha, and I realized I hadn't understood anything at all. This is not a story about saving someone. I want to be clear about that from the beginning because too many men in my position, white, trail-worn, moderately weathered, have told versions of this story where they are the hero, where the act of noticing a suffering person somehow counts as rescue. I'm not that man, or I'm trying not to be. What I am is a witness, a reluctant, frequently confused, occasionally cowardly witness to something I still don't fully have the words for, even now, even sitting here with my 3rd cup of coffee, going cold beside me and the Rio Salado whispering outside the window like it has something to say and won't just say it. Nasha wore a veil, not a veil in the ceremonial sense, not cloth, not fabric, a veil built out of years. Out of loss so dense and deliberate that it had calcified into something you could almost reach out and touch. She had built it one grief at a time, the way a bird builds a nest, slowly, purposefully, using whatever was at hand. I didn't lift that veil. That part of the story's title is a lie, or at least a simplification. What happened was something slower and stranger and more uncomfortable than lifting. What happened was that I sat down close enough, long enough, that the veil began, in ways I still can't entirely explain, to trust me. What happened after that changed everything I thought I knew about silence, and courage, and the remarkable, terrible endurance of the human heart. I keep a logbook. Have since I was 19 years old, and a trail boss named DeLacy told me that a man who doesn't write down what he sees eventually forgets he saw it. I took that advice more seriously than anything else DeLacy ever said, which wasn't much, and I've filled 31 of those books over the years, black-covered, cloth-bound, the kind the dry goods store in Tucson stocks near the back where nobody looks. I write in them every night before I sleep. Not journals exactly, not diaries. More like depositions, statements of fact, of event, of observation. The kind of record that, if I died, might be handed to someone and make them understand at least the geography of my days, if not the full emotional cartography. I mention this because it matters. Because the woman I'm about to tell you about, Nasha, she also kept a kind of record. Not in writing, but in her body. In the way she held herself and moved through space and responded to certain sounds, certain words, certain tones of voice. Her memory was stored differently than mine, but it was no less meticulous, no less precise. We just didn't know how to read each other's records, not at first. The year was 1881. The month was late October, when the desert stopped pretending to be warm and started making serious preparations for its cold season. I was working a stretch of territory along the Gila River on behalf of a cattle outfit out of Safford, a man named Caldwell who ran about 300 head and needed someone willing to ride the southern fence line twice a week, check for breaches, and report back on anything unusual. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that suited a man who preferred the company of his own thoughts to most alternatives, which at that particular point in my life described me exactly. My name is Elias Cutter, 41 years old in 1881, though I felt closer to 55 most mornings. Former Army scout, former stage messenger, former enough things that the word former had started to feel like my primary identity. I was tall enough that horses required a moment's adjustment when I mounted, and thin enough that I'd been told, on more than one occasion, that I looked like something the wind had argued with and won. My personal quirk beyond the logbook, I talked to myself constantly in a low murmur, a running commentary on everything I observed. Not because I was lonely, or not only because of that, but because the act of narrating helped me see more clearly. Made me put language to things I might otherwise slide past. My second horse, a Palomino named Biscuit who I acquired in '78, had developed an expression of mild disapproval at my commentary that I found, in its way, endearing. On a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October, riding the southern line in a wind that had decided to be personal about it, I found the sheep. Or rather, I found what was left of them, 4 animals, 2 still alive, 2 not, in a shallow gully about a quarter-mile west of the fence line. The dead ones had been dead a while. I won't describe the smell except to say I gave Biscuit his head briefly, and he backed us upwind with a professionalism I appreciated. The living ones were tangled in scrub, thin in the way animals get when they've been moving without purpose for days. Their wool matted with caliche and something dark I didn't want to examine too carefully. Sheep meant a herder. A herder meant someone who might have information about what else was moving through this particular valley. I followed the obvious logic of this and began looking. I found her at the edge of a dry creek bed, about 300 yards south of the gully, sitting with her back against a boulder the color of old bone. She was Apache, Western Apache, I would learn later Tonto band, and she was perhaps 55 years old, though she had the quality of someone for whom age had ceased to be a meaningful measurement. She was sitting very still, the way animals go still when they're conserving resources they're not sure they can replenish. Her hands were in her lap, open, palms upward. Her eyes were open too. She was looking at something beyond the rocks and the scrub and the cold October sky, looking at something that wasn't in this particular geography at all. I dismounted at a distance I judged respectful, which was maybe 40 feet, and stood there for a moment, watching her watch nothing. Biscuit made the noise he makes when he's waiting for me to do something. I murmured under my breath, "I don't know either, Biscuit. Give me a minute." She didn't react to my voice, not in the way a startled person would, no flinching, no turning of the head. But something in her expression shifted infinitesimally. The particular quality of her not looking changed slightly. Like a window that had been closed suddenly became slightly less closed. I said in Spanish, the common currency of the territory when English wouldn't serve, that I wasn't anyone to worry about. That I'd found the sheep. That 2 of them were still alive. She said nothing. I said that I could leave her alone if she wanted, and that I would. That I'd tell no one I'd seen her, which was probably a foolish promise to make, but felt, in the moment, like the most honest one available. She said nothing. I stood there another 5 minutes, feeling the wind work around my collar and Biscuit's impatience vibrate through the reins I was holding. Then I sat down. Not close to her. I sat down on a flat rock about 20 feet away, facing mostly in the same direction she was facing, as if whatever she was looking at might be worth observing from a different angle. That seemed to be the right thing, or at least the least wrong thing, because she shifted slightly, a quarter turn of the head, and for a moment, just a moment, her eyes moved to me and then moved back to the middle distance. And that was all. But I wrote it in my logbook that night. She looked. Even people who have decided the world has nothing left to offer them, even they sometimes look. I came back the next day. I wasn't entirely sure why. I told myself I was checking on the sheep, which was partly true. I'd gotten the 2 living ones to a water source and left them, and I wanted to see how they'd managed. I told myself it was practical, which it partially was. I did not tell myself, because I was not quite ready to, that there was something about the quality of that woman's stillness that had been working at the edges of my thoughts all night. She was in the same place, or close to it. She'd moved perhaps 20 feet south to where the boulder's shadow fell differently in the morning. The hands, the posture, the specific texture of her not being present, all the same. I brought water and some dried meat and 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth. The food kind, not the horse kind, though Biscuit gave them a hopeful look when I took them out. I set them on a flat rock within her reach, about 10 feet from where she sat. I didn't try to hand them to her directly. Something about the geometry of direct offering felt wrong, felt like it required a transaction she wasn't capable of completing. Then I sat back down on my rock and did what I'd done the day before. I kept company at a distance without demanding anything in return. She didn't touch the food while I was there. But when I came back the following morning, both biscuits were gone and the water had been drunk, and the cloth had been folded into a small, precise square and left where I could find it. I wrote that down too. On the 4th day, a man came looking for her. He arrived from the south on a gray horse that had been ridden hard and recently, lathered at the shoulders, breathing in the tight way horses breathe when they've been asked for more than they comfortably have. The man was Apache as well, younger than her, mid-30s perhaps, wiry in the way people become when endurance has been required of them for long enough that their body has simply eliminated everything extraneous. He had the look of someone who had been afraid for several days, and was managing it with a discipline that must have been exhausting. He saw me before he saw her. We regarded each other across about 60 feet of scrub and cholla, and I had the precise sensation of being weighed by a scale I didn't understand the calibration of. I held still. I had my hand nowhere near my gun. These were the facts available to him, and I hoped they would be legible. He said something in Apache. I understood very little Apache. Enough to know it was a question. Enough to know from the direction of his eyes that he was asking about the woman. I pointed toward where she was sitting, around the boulder's curve. He looked at my face carefully. Then he looked at where I'd pointed. Then he did something I didn't expect. He looked back at me and nodded, a single brief movement, and rode toward her. I listened to what happened next from my side of the boulder. Their conversation was quieter than I expected, given how far he'd clearly ridden and what that kind of distance implies about urgency. There was a long silence from her side, and then a sound I can only describe as the kind of exhalation that carries years inside it. Not quite a sob, not quite a sigh. Something between the two that doesn't have an English word that fits it. He talked for a while after that, low and steady. She was quiet. Then she said something, the first words I had heard from her in 4 days, and her voice was lower than I'd expected, rougher, the voice of someone whose vocal cords had not been asked to perform their function for some time. He stayed 2 hours, then he rode away south, and she was still there. But something had changed. I couldn't see it precisely. It was like watching a sky that's been overcast for days develop, somewhere near the horizon, the thinnest strip of different colored light. Not yet dawn, not yet hope, but the possibility of either. That evening, for the first time, she spoke to me. Not in English, she had none or had chosen not to use it. Not in Spanish. In Apache, which I barely understood. But she spoke slowly, and she used her hands to supplement the words, and what I gathered, incompletely, certainly imperfectly, was something about a place to the north. A camp or a settlement or somewhere that held something she needed. She repeated one word 3 times, the same sequence of sounds, and looked at me in the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether they're worth the risk of trusting. I said in Spanish that I thought I understood, that I could try to help her get there if she wanted, that I didn't know the country north of the river well, but I knew it better than I knew nothing, which was my alternative. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Biscuit. Then she looked at her hands in her lap. Then she stood up. She stood slowly, the way a person stands when their body has been consulting sorrow for a long time and sorrow has been sitting in the joints. But she stood, and she walked toward the sheep, the 2 survivors, who had wandered back to within sight of the boulder over the past several days, and she put her hand on the neck of the nearest one in a gesture of such simple, ordinary tenderness that it arrived in my chest like a flat stone. I wrote that night, she stood up. I don't know what it costs a person to do that after whatever cost her the years before it. But she stood up and touched something living, and that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, possibly the largest thing I have witnessed in 14 years of watching this country do its worst. We didn't leave that day, or the next. I stayed near and she stayed near, and Biscuit supervised with his characteristic expression of weighted judgment. On the second evening, she ate in my presence for the first time, sitting close enough to the small fire I'd built that I could see her face in the light, which was a different thing than seeing it in daylight. Fire does something to faces, makes visible things that daylight allows people to hide. What I saw in her face in the firelight was a damage so old it had become structural. Not fresh grief, old grief. The kind that had stopped being painful in the acute sense and had become instead a kind of architecture. The bones of a face built around an absence. I did not ask about it. I knew at an instinctive level that asking was not the right gesture. What she had offered, proximity, the willingness to sit near a fire in the presence of a man she had every reason not to trust, was itself a significant concession. I didn't want to spend it. Instead, I did what I always do in the evenings. I opened my logbook and wrote. My pen moved across the page in the small, scratchy way it moves, and I was aware of her awareness of me, the way you're aware of being watched without quite being watched. Not surveillance. Something closer to curiosity, suppressed, kept at a distance of its own. After perhaps 20 minutes of this, she said something. One word, I looked up. She was looking at the logbook, at the pen moving across the page. And the word she'd said, I didn't have it precisely, but her expression filled in the gap was something like, "What is that?" Writing, I said in English because that was the word I had, and then in Spanish, escritura. She considered this. Then she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as evaluation, the expression of someone running a rapid calculus about whether a particular piece of information is safe to offer. Then slowly, she reached into the fold of her blanket and took out a small piece of hide, worn nearly translucent with handling, tied with a strip of sinew. She held it out to me in the same open palm gesture she'd been sitting with when I first found her, but different now, active instead of passive. Offering instead of waiting. I reached out and took it carefully. On the hide, in a language I couldn't read but could recognize as deliberate, as intentional, as invested, were marks. Symbols, not the pictographic notation I was familiar with from various tribal traditions, something more personal than that, more idiosyncratic. Her own system, perhaps, her own record, her own deposition. I held it for a moment, aware of its weight, which was the weight of things that have been carried a long time. Then I looked up at her. She was watching me with an expression I had not yet seen on her face. She was watching to see if I understood. I said in the slowest, most careful Spanish I owned, "You wrote this down." And she said, her first complete sentence in any language I'd heard from her, something I parsed only partially, but whose core meaning arrived with complete clarity. "I wrote it so I wouldn't forget." I closed my logbook that night and sat with it in my lap for a while before I wrote the evening's entry. When I did write, it took a long time. I kept crossing things out. I kept starting sentences and then finding them insufficient. What I finally wrote was this. She keeps a record too. Different medium, same impulse. The same terror underneath it, the terror that what happened, if not written down, if not marked somewhere, will be treated by time as though it never occurred. As though the people involved never occurred. I have been keeping these logbooks for 22 years, and I have never thought about why until tonight. Tonight she showed me the reason, not for my benefit, for everyone who isn't here to speak for themselves. I think I've been keeping these records for the same reason she does. I think, for the first time in a long time, I am not the only person in this desert who understands that. We left on a morning that couldn't decide between cloud and sun. The sky doing that thing it does in late October where it seems to be rehearsing something, testing options, committing to nothing. The sheep came with us. Nasha walked alongside the smaller of the two, the one she'd touched that first evening, her hand resting intermittently on its back with the ease of long habit. I rode Biscuit. We moved north. I had not sent word to Caldwell. This was a professional failing I acknowledged in my logbook the night before we left, and then declined to correct. The fence line would have to wait a week. Whatever Caldwell thought about that was a problem for a version of me that existed after this particular thing was finished. Her name, I learned it that first morning of travel, and I learned it the way you learn things from people who have decided, in stages, that you might be worth teaching. She wrote it in the caliche dust of a flat stone, and then spoke it aloud twice, and looked at me until I repeated it back at an acceptable approximation. Nasha. I learned later that in her language it carried the meaning of something like owl, though meanings in translation always flatten, always lose the resonance that the original speaker hears. I wrote it in my logbook with 3 underlines. I had never underlined anything before. She did not tell me, not yet, what we were going north to find, or what we were going north to return to, which I gradually understood was closer to the truth. This was not an approach toward something new. This was a going back. The quality of her movement, something about the way she oriented herself to the country, a subtle calibration that was less than confidence but more than hope, told me that this geography was not foreign to her. That somewhere in this direction there was a prior version of a life she had been separated from. I didn't ask. I rode alongside and navigated the terrain and kept my commentary to a murmur low enough not to carry, and I wrote in the evenings and ate what I had and shared what I had. And she ate and was present and sometimes spoke and sometimes didn't. What I learned of her story, I learned in fragments. Incomplete, imprecise, assembled from what she chose to offer and what I managed to understand. And I want to be honest about that. About the gaps, the places where my understanding was approximate, the ways in which even now I hold this account with the awareness that it is filtered through my limitations. A man who grew up in Missouri and learned Spanish from a muleskinner in Sonora does not have the tools to perfectly receive the testimony of a Tonto Apache woman in 1881. I am aware of this. I note it as I would note it in a deposition, Witness is not a reliable translator, but is the available one. What I understood was this. She had a son, had, past tense, in the specific way that past tense functions when the absence it describes is recent enough to still be present. The word she used for him, the Apache word, which she said once and I couldn't reproduce, she said with a quality of control that told me the control was the thing, not the calm. That maintaining her voice at that register was an act of physical discipline. The boy had been 10 years old. His name I could not parse. She said it only once and then stopped. I wrote in my logbook that night in the margins because I'd already filled the page. Do not ask about the son. Not now, probably not ever. Let her decide if and when. There had been a removal. The word she used for it, supplemented by her hands, described something like being lifted from a place and placed somewhere else. A gesture that started with something rooted and stable and ended with something scattered, unmoored. The San Carlos Reservation had been expanding its intake through the late 1870s, the Army consolidating bands from across the territory with an efficiency that had no particular interest in the distinctions those bands considered fundamental. Tonto Apache and White Mountain Apache and Yavapai Apache were not the same people, did not share the same customs or the same country or the same internal logic, but they had been collected into San Carlos as though these distinctions were bureaucratic inconveniences rather than entire worldviews. Nasha had been at San Carlos, had been there for 3 years. The young man who'd ridden out from the south and sat with her for 2 hours, her nephew, I eventually understood, her sister's son, had come to tell her that there was a possibility of returning to something. Not the whole thing. The whole thing was not available, but a piece of it, a small community of people from her original band who had been permitted, or had managed, to relocate north of the Gila. A woman she had known since childhood. A particular canyon she had a particular relationship with. That was what North was. That was what the sheep were, not just animals, the last tangible remnant of something she had built. She had kept them alive through the walking and the removal and the 3 years of San Carlos and the walking back, and they were still alive, and I think the fact of their continued existence was doing a specific kind of work inside her that I don't have quite the right words for. Proof of something. Evidence. That a thing she'd tended had survived what had happened to her. On the 3rd day of travel, we came to a dry wash that should have been crossable, and was not, the recent rains having deposited enough soil and debris to make it treacherous for the sheep. I assessed it for a while, walking its edge north and south, while Biscuit stood nearby radiating skepticism. Nasha watched me assess it, and then, without comment, began moving along the eastern bank in the direction I hadn't tried yet. I followed her. She found the crossing in about 10 minutes, a narrowing, a natural ford that had a solid base under the soft surface, revealed by a specific quality of the way the wash curved at that point. She tested it herself first, walking across without the sheep, feet finding the stable substrate in a way that looked uncanny until I understood it as knowledge. She knew this wash, or she knew how to read a wash like this one, which was a form of knowledge older and more reliable than anything I was carrying. I said in Spanish that I was impressed. She looked at me sideways with an expression that contained no false modesty and no performance of modesty either. Just acknowledgement. A fact had been demonstrated. She had demonstrated it. This was correct. Moving on. I wrote that evening. She moves through this country like it is a conversation she has been having for her entire life and periodically pausing and now resuming. I move through it like a man with a map that is mostly accurate and occasionally very wrong. These are not equivalent relationships with the same terrain. I am beginning to understand this in a way I was not understanding it before. On the 4th day, we were stopped by 3 men. I say men because that is the most neutral available word. 2 were U.S. Army, a corporal, and a private, young enough that their uniforms sat on them like clothes borrowed from someone taller. The 3rd was a civilian, a contract interpreter named Hobbs, who I had met once, briefly, in Safford 3 years earlier, and remembered as a man whose primary talent was making himself comfortable with whatever the current power structure required of him. They had come from the east on a track that intersected ours near a water tank, one of the scattered earthen tanks that collected rainfall in this part of the territory, barely sufficient, perpetually insufficient. They saw us at the same moment we saw them, and the geometry of our positions made avoidance impractical. The corporal, whose name I learned was Dawes, looked at Nasha the way men in his position looked at Apache women who were not where the army expected them to be, with an administrative sharpening of attention that had nothing personal in it, which somehow made it worse. He asked me, in English, what I was doing and who she was. I said I was a civilian contractor working for a cattle outfit out of Safford, which was true. I said she was a woman I'd found injured on the trail and was helping to a settlement north of the river, which was approximately true in the way that approximations work when the exact truth would cause more problems than it solved. Hobbs looked at Nasha and said something in Apache. I watched her face with the care of someone who had been studying it for several days. She went very still, not the still of the boulder, the existential stillness of those first days. This was a different stillness, focused, tactical, watchful. The stillness of someone who has been in a version of this moment before and knows the margins available to her, which are narrow. She answered Hobbs in Apache. He translated for Dawes. She had been at San Carlos. She was a widow. She was traveling to a permitted settlement on the North Bank. I did not know if any of this was precisely accurate, but her voice had a particular flatness when she said it, the flatness of a person giving a bureaucratic answer to a bureaucratic question with a bureaucratic authority that does not deserve anything more than bureaucracy. And I thought, she knows exactly what she's doing. She knows the exact number of ounces of truth to hand to this particular kind of man. She has been doing this calculation for years. Dawes looked at me, then at her, then at the sheep, as if the sheep were the most suspicious element of the scene, which given everything was somehow the most insulting detail. He made a notation in a small book and told me to make sure she arrived where she was going and didn't linger in army territory. I said I would see to it. He rode away. Hobbs stayed one moment longer, long enough to look at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something between discomfort and apology, gone before it could be read. Then he rode after Dawes, and the private followed, and we were alone with the water tank and the sheep and the quiet that came back to fill the space where the men had been. I turned to her. She had not moved, but her hands, which she had kept very still throughout the encounter, were now pressed flat against her thighs, and I could see, from the angle, from the particular quality of the pressure, that she was using them to keep something steady, to hold something in place that the encounter had tried to dislodge. I didn't say anything. Biscuit snorted, with the timing of a horse who doesn't know he's being eloquent. After a long moment, Nasha made a sound, half-breath, half-word, and then she crouched down beside the sheep she'd been walking with all day, and she put both arms around its neck, her face briefly against its wool, and held on. I turned and made a great show of consulting the horizon. I wrote that night, there are forms of exposure that aren't physical. She had just been asked to prove she was allowed to exist in a particular place on the map, to document herself, to justify her route and her company and her sheep to two young men with army uniforms and one man who has learned to make a living translating power to those it's being used against. She passed the inspection. But the inspection itself was the violence. The asking was the harm. I am going to carry that distinction around for a while. On the fifth evening we made camp in the lee of a sandstone formation that provided shelter from the wind, which had resumed its personal interest in me specifically. She built the fire. I had made the fire every other night and had not thought about this, about the delineation, until she simply took it over on this evening with a quiet authority that suggested she had been tolerating my fire building longer than it deserved. Her fire was better than mine. It was contained and efficient in a way mine wasn't, the same heat, or close to it, but using a third of the fuel. I watched her build it with the open attention of a man who has spent too much time assuming he knows how to do things. She noticed me watching. She looked at me and then at the fire and then back at me. She said, in Spanish, one of the 30 or 40 words we shared in common, and the syllable contained something I can only describe as the sound of a person who has made peace with the irony of her situation. I laughed, not a big laugh, a small, startled one, the kind that comes out before you decide whether it's appropriate. And she watched me laugh, and then at the corner of her mouth something moved. Not a smile, or the beginning of a smile, the far precursor, the seismic event that happens miles underground before the surface shows anything. It was there for perhaps 2 seconds, and then it was gone. But I had seen it. I wrote about it for half a page. She told me about the veil on that 5th night, Or she began to tell me the beginning of telling, which is a different thing. She spoke in Apache with the occasional Spanish word as a bridge, and I leaned into the language with everything I had, and what came across was partial and imprecise and still, somehow the most coherent thing anyone had said to me in months. She said there was a time before, a time when she had a different face, not literally, but the face a person has when the life around them is intact, when they have a son whose name they can say aloud, when they have a place in the country that knows them as much as they know it. She had had that face. She described it the way you describe something you're not sure you still have access to, carefully, with the precision of someone checking an inventory they're afraid may have changed. And then the removal, and the sun, and San Carlos, where she said this in Apache and her hands said it too, and I understood it in my sternum before I understood it in my head. She had decided that the safest thing was to stop having a face that could be read, to become, as much as possible, unreadable, to give no one anything to work with. The veil was not shame. I want to be absolutely clear about this because I have heard men describe Apache women's silence as shame, as submission, as various things that serve those men's interpretation of events. It was not shame. It was strategy. It was the intelligent application of the only protection available to her, the protection of a woman who has made herself, emotionally, unavailable for further loss. She built it, she said, or something that conveyed this with patience, slowly, like stacking stones. She built it and she lived behind it, and it kept certain things out and it kept certain things in, and it was, for several years, the thing that kept her alive. The problem, she said, and here her voice did something I hadn't heard it do before, a small roughening, a texture, was that after a while she couldn't always tell if she was protecting herself or burying herself. She stopped talking. The fire did what fires do in the silence. I didn't try to say anything that would fill the silence. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, dense, packed with the weight of what she'd just said. Filling it would have been a waste. What I did was open my logbook and turn to a blank page and slide it toward her, along with the pen. She looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. She didn't write, she drew a mark, a single mark, not a word, not a symbol I recognized, just a mark, but deliberate, intentional, a person leaving evidence that she had been present. She set the pen down. She looked at the mark in the page. Then she looked at me. I did not say, you can come back from this. I did not say, things will get better. I did not say any of the things that people say in these moments that are kind in intention and useless in practice. I said in the best Spanish I had, carefully, I'm going to keep this page. And she looked at the fire for a long time. And then she said, very quietly, in a language I didn't speak, something I didn't understand. But I knew, the way you know certain things without knowing how you know them, that it wasn't for me. It was for the person she had been before she built the walls. It was for the face she used to have. It was for him. And I understood then, in a way I had not understood before, that grief of this particular kind does not move in a straight line. It doesn't progress from point A to point B, it circles. It returns. It goes underground and comes back up somewhere you didn't expect it, and catches you without your defenses, and makes you say things in the dark to people you only started trusting 5 days ago. I closed the logbook carefully. I did not write anything else that night. The crossing was shallow here, the river in its late-season austerity, and the sheep managed it with the resigned competence of animals who have crossed enough rivers that rivers no longer require special consideration. Biscuit waded through with his characteristic expression of tolerance for the world's inconveniences. Nasha crossed without hesitation, without ceremony, as though the river were a threshold she had been waiting to cross for years, and was not going to give it the satisfaction of treating it as significant. But on the other side, she stopped. She stood on the north bank with water still dripping from the hem of her blanket, and she looked north, and something happened in her face that I had not seen before. Not the smile precursor from the fifth night. Something older and quieter. The expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they were not sure they would ever arrive at again, and is now trying to reconcile the version of themselves who left with the version who has returned. I stayed quiet. Biscuit, with rare sensitivity, also stayed quiet. She stood there for perhaps a minute, then she started walking. The canyon she had described, indirectly, incompletely, in the way she described things that mattered most, was about 4 miles northeast of the crossing. I followed her into country that became, gradually, different from the open desert we'd been traveling. More broken, more vertical. The terrain developing opinions about itself, rising into the kind of landscape that has its own interior weather, its own shadows in the middle of the afternoon, its own sound. The sound of a place that has been there long enough to stop being indifferent to the people who move through it. She knew where she was going. This was not navigation in the sense I practiced, checking landmarks, consulting memory of a map. This was something older than that. Her body knew the route the way bodies know things that were learned before language existed for them. She didn't look at the sun to orient herself. She didn't hesitate at forks. She walked, and the country responded, and I followed. An hour in, we heard voices. They came from the east, the high, carrying voices of people engaged in the ordinary commerce of daily life, the kind of sound that is deeply unremarkable in a settlement and extraordinary when you've been moving through silence for 6 days. Nasha's pace changed. Not faster exactly, but something internal shifted, a change in the quality of the forward lean, like a compass needle arriving at true north. And then we came around a bend in the canyon wall, and there was a camp. Small 8 or 9 shelters, 2 fires, dogs, a corral that held 5 horses. The kind of camp that is built to be practical rather than permanent, but which has the quality of somewhere people have stayed long enough to leave traces of themselves, to make the ground remember them. Children running the perimeter of the corral. An old man sitting with something in his hands, working it. 2 women near the closer fire, one of whom looked up the moment we appeared. She went still. She was perhaps 60 years old, this woman by the fire. Broad-shouldered, gray-streaked hair, a face that had been weathered into something very close to the landscape around it. She looked at us, at me briefly, at Nasha for a long time, and then she stood up with a speed that was inconsistent with her age and walked toward us. She said something in Apache that I did not understand. But the word she ended on, the name, I had heard said in the same tone that you say a name when you are testing whether the person is real, whether they have actually come back, or whether your mind has started making things up on its own. Nasha said something back, one short sentence. And the woman reached out both hands and took Nasha's face between her palms, and she looked at her for a long time, looking hard, the way you look at something you haven't been sure existed until this moment. And then she said something short, declarative, the tone of a woman making a statement of fact, and pulled Nasha toward her and held her. Nasha stood in this embrace with her arms at her sides for a moment. And then her arms came up, and she held on. I turned away. I found something compelling to study in the middle distance, a rock formation, a cloud, the particular tilt of Biscuit's ear. I cleared my throat, which was having a problem I didn't want to examine. I wrote nothing down. I made no notes. I let that moment belong entirely to the 2 women and did not try to make it mine by recording it. When I turned back after a time that I deliberately did not measure, they had separated. Nasha was speaking, more than I had heard her speak in the entire 6 days of traveling together. Not fluently, not easily, the words coming out with the halting quality of a person relearning a mode of being they had suspended. But they were coming. They were coming. The woman's name was Alchese's mother, or that was the approximation I eventually assembled. She was the mother of a man named Alchese who had his own complex history with the army and the territory that I won't do justice to here. Her name for herself she told me later, laughing slightly at my attempts to reproduce it, and we arrived at something in Spanish that she accepted with amusement. Lupa. Not accurate, but serviceable. Lupa showed me the camp with an efficiency that suggested she had made this kind of orientation for visitors before, not distrust exactly, but a professional thoroughness, a woman who liked to establish the terms of a thing before the thing proceeded. She showed me where the horses were, where water could be accessed, where visitors slept, what the camp's rules were. Her Spanish was better than mine in several respects that she made clear without making a production of it. I asked carefully whether Nasha had family here, whether there were others who. She looked at me with an expression that stopped the question. She had a son, she said in Spanish, and the way she said it, past tense, deliberate, looking at me steadily to make sure I received the information properly, told me everything I needed to know about what had happened at San Carlos and what the weight of the journey north had been carrying. I said I understood. She looked at me for another moment, evaluating. Then she said with a directness that I found in the moment both brutal and generous, "She came back. That is enough. Don't ask her what it cost." I said I wouldn't. She seemed to believe me. Or she decided to believe me, which might be the same thing or might not. I stayed 3 days. This was longer than I had planned. Longer than I could professionally justify, if Caldwell ever asked me to justify it, which he did. And I didn't. And he let it go because the fence line had been fine in my absence, and there are moments when even practical men recognize that explanations would cost more than they're worth. During those 3 days, I witnessed things I am going to do my best to describe, without overclaiming what they meant. I watched Nasha sleep on the first night, not in the way I'm making that sound, but in the clinical sense of a man who had been traveling with someone in severe distress for 6 days and needed to know for his own peace of mind that she was breathing and rested. She slept deeply. She slept with the specific quality of exhaustion that comes from something more than physical effort. The exhaustion of a person who has finally, for the first time in a long time, allowed themselves to feel safe enough to put down their defenses long enough to sleep properly. I wrote about it. I have seen men sleep like that after battles. After the specific moment when a thing they were holding together finally stops requiring them to hold it. I watched her on the second morning walk into the canyon with Lupa. I watched them from a distance. I had positioned myself at the corral, useful work, the kind of background occupation that provides cover for the impulse to observe. They walked for an hour. I don't know what they said. But when they came back, Nasha had a different quality about her. Still not healed, not restored, not anything as simple as those words, but something that I can only describe as reoriented. Like a compass that has been sitting too long in a drawer and is being held near something magnetic for the first time in years, the needle finding its direction by degrees. She came to where I was working at the corral and stood nearby for a moment. "Gracias," she said, "thank you." I said in Spanish that I hadn't done much. She looked at me with the expression I had come to understand as her version of correcting an error in the record. Then she went back to the camp. I stayed at the corral and did unnecessary work for a while. On the third day, she showed me the canyon. Not all of anything belongs to people who haven't earned the whole of it, and she was clear, without using many words, about which parts were mine to see and which parts weren't. But she showed me a section of the eastern wall in the afternoon light where something extraordinary existed. Marks on the stone. Many of them accumulated over time, not all her work, clearly, but some of them hers. A record kept in the only permanent medium available. The stone's surface worn smooth in certain places from hands pressing against it, marking it, the accumulated touching of many years and many people, the palimpsest of a community's long conversation with its own landscape. She pointed to a group of marks in the lower register at a height that a child would find comfortable. She didn't say anything, she just pointed. I looked at the marks, I looked at her. She put her hand against the stone, flat, palm down, the gesture that is both mark-making and touching and presence all at once. And then she stood there with her hand on the stone, and her face, in the afternoon light, in the canyon that knew her, in the company of the marks she and her son had made together, did something I have been trying to find language for since the moment it happened. The veil, the architecture of strategic necessary distance, didn't disappear. I don't want to tell a story where the veil simply vanishes and underneath it is the uncomplicated woman who existed before. That story would be a lie. The veil is structural. The things that made it structural are still true. What happened was something more complicated. What happened was that the veil, for a moment in the afternoon light in the canyon, became transparent. Not gone, transparent. And through it I could see both things simultaneously. The woman who had learned, out of absolute necessity, to be unreadable, and underneath that, the woman who had made marks on canyon walls with a 10-year-old boy and kept a record on scraped hide and named herself after an owl and built efficient fires and found the ford in a difficult wash. Both of them visible, both of them present. The one not replacing the other but existing simultaneously, each required by the other, each the cost and the proof of the other. I don't know if she was crying. The light was wrong for me to see that clearly, and I was not going to step closer to find out. I kept my distance, and I stood there, and I was present for it the way you can be present for something without claiming it. After a long time, long enough that the afternoon light had shifted, and the canyon's interior had deepened into its own color, she took her hand off the stone. She stood straight, she inhaled. She turned and walked back toward the camp without looking at me, which was not rudeness but privacy, the deliberate claiming of a private moment's conclusion. I stood in the canyon for a while after she left. I opened my logbook. I wrote for perhaps 20 minutes without stopping. I wrote about the marks on the stone and the hand against the stone and the particular quality of the light and the sheep, still alive, somewhere near the camp's water. I wrote about the way she had walked in the first days and the way she had walked today and the difference between them. I wrote about the record I was holding in my book and the record she kept in other media and the record in the stone and the way all of these different records were doing the same work, refusing the same erasure, insisting on the same fact. We were here. We were here. We are here. I don't know what I expected to feel at the end of writing all that. I don't know what conclusion I expected the writing to provide. I closed the book and sat with it in my hands for a while in the dimming canyon. I left the following morning, early, before most of the camp was fully awake, because the particular emotional accounting that comes at the end of something like this is easier to conduct without an audience. Nasha was awake. She was standing near the corral when I led Biscuit out, the smaller sheep beside her, her hand on its neck. She looked like someone who had arrived somewhere and was in the early stages of deciding whether to let herself know it. We stood across the corral from each other. The morning was cold in the way October mornings are cold in the canyon country, not the hostile cold of the open desert, but the contained cold of a place with walls, a cold that suggested enclosure, that was almost protective. I didn't know what to say. I rarely do at the end of things. I am better at recording than at concluding. What I managed was, in Spanish, "I'll remember what you showed me." She looked at me for a moment, then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She reached into the fold of her blanket, the same gesture she'd made on the 5th night, reaching for the worn piece of hide, and took out a new piece, smaller, tied with a different strip of sinew. She walked around the corral and handed it to me, not with the open-palm presentation of offering, but with the deliberate transfer of someone giving you something that is yours to carry. I took it. I looked down at it, a single mark, the same mark she'd made in my logbook on the 5th night. I looked up. She was already turning back toward the sheep. I mounted Biscuit, I turned south, I rode out of the canyon into the morning. I didn't look back, not because I was afraid to, but because some things are more themselves when you don't keep checking to see if they're still there. I have the piece of hide. It is in my desk at the house I eventually settled into near the river, in the drawer where I keep things that are too important for the logbooks and too strange for conventional keeping. I have looked at it many times over the years since 1881. I have never been able to explain to anyone who's asked what it means. I tell them it's a record. They assume I mean a record of the journey, of the woman, of the story. I don't correct them, because it is a record of those things, but it is not only those things. It is also, and I know how this sounds, and I am putting it in writing anyway, something like a proof of presence, of the continued insistence of a particular person on existing in a world that had several times attempted to make her less real, less legible, less here. She is here, that is what the mark means. Whatever else the world has done, she is here. I keep my own record for the same reason. I have been keeping it for 31 volumes, and I will keep it until I can't anymore. De Lacy told me once that a man who doesn't write down what he sees eventually forgets he saw it. But that's only part of it. The rest of it, the part De Lacy didn't have the words for, or didn't think to say, is that what you write down becomes real in a different way than what only lives in memory. It becomes something the world can't take back. Something that requires, from anyone who comes after, at least the admission that it happened. Nasha knew this before I did. She's been writing it down longer. The last entry in my logbook from that journey reads, October 31st, 1881, North Canyon Country. She made this place remember her. I think she was always going to eventually. I think the veil was not who she was. I think it was what she needed in order to stay alive long enough to come back to who she was. I think those are different things and the difference matters. The sheep are doing well. I counted them before I left. I am riding south now. The canyon is behind me, and the desert is in front of me, and Biscuit has opinions about the pace. And I am murmuring commentary into the morning as usual, and somewhere to the north, there is a woman with her hand on a stone that knows her name.